Episode 11, Mercantilism. Do you want pirates? Because that's how you get pirates. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the economic idea of mercantilism and how it led to the food and ideas about food 17th century colonists brought with them, and why mercantilism is how you get pirates. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. Before we can get to pirates, and I promise you we will get to pirates, you get to come with me as I follow the yarn backwards for just a bit to see how Europe got to mercantilism and just what mercantilism is. I know some of you may be having these really vague high school flashbacks. You've heard of these things. That's fine. I did the same thing as I picked up the history of economy tomes and waded through the untranslated Latin tags for you. An important thing to have in mind as we move through this is that 17th century American food really was just European food. In the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, yes, there had been a bit more incorporation of things like chilies and tomatoes and corn and the local fruits. But this was partly because the Spanish and Portuguese had had the good sense/luck to choose places that were better at growing more foods than New England. And it was also true that the Iberian Peninsula had always had a more varied outlook on food due to more trade with the Mediterranean Ring. And let's face it, it was easier to grow more different stuff in sunny Spain than in cloudy England. And everyone who has ever claimed the peninsula has really dug the olive oil and wine. So, European economics before the 17th century. The Western Roman Empire went out with a whimper in the late 5th century. But even before then, all the things that had given Europe a vibrant trading and money economy during the Roman presence had been grinding to a halt. The roads were degrading, only limited quantities of money were being minted, so coins generally were getting worn away, hoarded, melted down, and buried. The regular people just wanted to get on with their farming and small crafts and were suffering from the rise in banditry and the disintegration of the roads. So everyone who had some sort of a castle or fort or defensible position started gathering farmers about them. These military strongmen and their community of farmers tended to go with an arrangement something like, I'll provide food and some work for you if you defend me from wandering marauders and give me a place to retreat to if it really gets bad. That obligation of protection, with some other stuff I'm totally skipping over, was pretty much what granted the military leaders their nobility. As the military leaders morphed into noble lords, they made it illegal to leave the land a farmer's ancestors had agreed to work. Even if the current lord asked for too much food, too much labor, too much military service, or marauded their own people, took away land, or were just crappy defenders. And that's what made the farmers into serfs. I know I'm vastly oversimplifying, but this gets to the heart of the arrangement. The result was each of these groupings of farmers plus a protective warlord formed these almost entirely self-sufficient enclaves. Food stopped being a trade good. People weren't quite reduced to subsistence farming, but it was close. As a result of these rules, the collapse of commerce, and crummy roads, people stopped moving around, but the borders moved around. And things went on like this for about 1,000 years, like one giant Settlers of Catan tournament, with bonus pieces for cathedrals and castles. During this period, what had started as approximately 1 zillion states run by different noble families and their clients, always squabbling with their neighbors over unstable borders, started to coalesce into larger, more stable states. The Catholic Church became the center of spiritual life, and new ideas were just not done. The feudal economy sort of settled down. Everyone just stayed where they started. Almost nobody used money. The price of everything was in work or kind. You plow this much land for me, you grind this much grain, you trade me this much of the next pig you slaughter, that kind of thing. But more importantly, because Europe was all these little, tiny, closed economies, the prices of everything stayed mostly the same for a very long time. But in the 14th century, Europe was shaken like a bag of Scrabble tiles. This was the century of the 100 Years' War, the worst of the plague, and a whole bunch of very bad weather and harvests. From the point of view of the peasantry, the Catholic Church had done little to protect anyone from the war, the bad harvests, or the plague. I mean, the Church had taken multiple parts in the war. Well, the many little wars that ended up being labeled as the one long war. To make things worse, the Church had gotten into a fight with itself and had two popes at the same time, or a pope and an anti-pope. It was all very confusing, infuriating, and a perfect way to open people up to new ideas when it came to religion, technology, and their horizons. Just doing things the way they had always been done lost its attraction for lots of people. And thus we roll up onto the shores of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Discovery. It's the 16th century, and there's this new mix of ideas in finance, war, religion, and the organization and the size of the world. And possibly most important, the printing press. Movable type and paper books had arrived. Not only were there all these new ideas, there's now a new, faster way to spread those ideas around. Sound familiar? Now with the arrival of gunpowder and advances in metallurgy and ironworking, warhead cannons was more expensive and definitely favored the consolidation of states. And to manage a larger state, travel became a priority, so roads started to improve again. And with the advances in boat technology I've mentioned before, plus the development of cannons, taking the war to the water became a thing. So navies were developed right alongside the exploration expeditions. And as I talked about in the salt episodes, to make journeys of exploration and navies work, casks of salted food had to be procured in large quantities, which means people were starting to get paid in money again. And the influx of the New World Spanish silver and the African gold meant there started to be a lot more coins. So by the 17th century, Europe had gone from almost no one needing or using money to lots of people having access to some money because suddenly there was more money to use. And due to salt and better roads and larger states and lots of other things I'm totally glossing over right now, Europe was well on its way to being a cross-pollinating, mobile, mercantilist economy rather than a static, closed, feudal economy. At the center of the mercantilist economy was the merchant. When roads were bad, there were no large cities, and mainly luxuries were transported any distance. Merchants were often itinerant individuals wandering about with a marginal existence. But as cities grew and valuable and useful goods in larger quantities started arriving on boats, like saltfish, spices, sugar, tobacco, cocoa, porcelain, and silks, merchant became a different job. Suddenly, there was more in the world that could be stored, distributed, and sold later. Now there were more boats to move these things around further than they ever had before. And not only could merchants sell these things off the boat, merchants could also sell things to the boats. Salted meat, ship's biscuit, sailcloth, nails, pitch, tar, and so on. And not just to the voyagers, there were also those navies to supply. And the things they were supplying were manufactured or semi-manufactured goods. The raw materials had to be gathered, work had to be organized, and the objects made, delivered, and paid for. Contracts had to be created and written, warehouses built, guarded, filled, and emptied. Accounts had to be kept. So now you had merchants who were building and driving mercantilism. But what was it? To try to slow things down and make sense of all these new changes, the larger states that had coalesced by the 17th century from the Middle Ages zillion-state free-for-all began to make some assumptions and devise some economic rules. The first one they could all agree upon was that there was a fixed amount of wealth in the world. The next thing everyone agreed on was that wealth was land and the gold it earned. And because the amount of land and gold were fixed, the prevailing attitude was, I can only win if someone else is losing. Keeping score was done with piles of silver and gold. The one with the biggest pile was the winner. A very Scrooge McDuck way of viewing the world. In this scheme, labor wasn't particularly valued, but the results of the labor, finished products, were. And the more shippable and shelf-stable a thing was, the more value it tended to have. By the 17th century, people started to look at the land around them and wonder, how can I make the land that I own do more? And particularly, make more of the things that can be sold. Thus, European kingdoms, principalities, dukedoms, all these states, each started looking at themselves kind of as big stores, but not in terms of variety, instead in terms of what could be sold for cash. And as any artisan knows, the raw materials are cheap, and to make money, you make what sells. All the value is in the finished product, but only if you have a buyer. So if your country was a store, the little people, the peasants, the serfs, they were the employees, and the biggest pile of gold wins, there were some simple things that you could do. First, don't buy anything. Make everything. If all your subjects were productive and you didn't send any money out of the country, then you were on track to win. If you made a surplus, you sold finished products to everyone else and got their money. Even better. Second, if you couldn't grow everything and must buy some stuff, make sure you only bought raw materials. That way, you wouldn't have any unemployed subjects. They still worked at making things from the raw materials, and you had the finished product to sell. Third, you could sell raw materials, but only if you were the only source. That way, you controlled the price. Fourth, did the little people of your country spend time and energy doing stuff that didn't go towards making that gold pile bigger? Well, that might just be wasted time. To win, you'll need to work on arranging things so time and land is more oriented towards building that gold pile. I mean, really, how happy do the little people need to be? Fair enough. But for a 17th century London shopper, such arrangements might cause some of the following issues to arise. For instance, what if I like brandy and only the French make brandy, and we only make whiskey? Can I still have brandy? The state responds, sure, you can have brandy, but you have to pay the government a little penalty for buying stuff from outside our circle. Let's call it a tariff. So now brandy is quite a bit more expensive than the local whiskey. Are you sure you still like brandy better? Back to the shopper. But what if the barreled herring I get from Holland is cheaper and way tastier? They have these like herring factories where they just crank it out and have these really high standards. Most of the English herring is smoked and doesn't last as long, and the local barreled herring isn't as tasty. Can't I just buy the tastier and cheaper Dutch herring? The state responds, sure, you can buy the Dutch herring, but we're going to tack on a little, let's call it a toll for bringing it over our border. Just another little tariff. Now it's much more expensive than the English herring. Just how much better is that Dutch herring, really? As you can see, under mercantilism, when the goal is to win with the largest pile of gold, governments were very ready to protect their own merchants to be sure more of the gold stays inside the lines that they have drawn. And that is part of why the New World colonies, and later the African colonies, became such an exciting thing. All these European states that were tariffing each other into trading dead ends saw this new land as a new game board where they could try new versions of the rules of this trade game. They could all claim more land to grow and harvest more raw materials to make more finished goods. Rum, buckskin trousers, seriously, watch Bridgerton. Saltfish, shingles, sugar, tobacco, and so on. They could stop buying stuff from the other countries and keep all their piles of gold inside their own countries, which created that rimless wheel I mentioned back in the sugar episodes. As each kingdom set up its own store, they set up store rules. All the Spanish colonies had to ship all the raw materials back to Spain in Spanish ships to Spanish merchants and got the price the Spanish merchants all got together and agreed to pay. Same for the Portuguese, same for the Dutch, same for the French, and same for the English colonies. And then all these colonies would have to buy the finished goods from the home country. Again, at the prices the merchants at home decided to charge them. And the colonials had to wait for the round trip. There were some Spanish colonies where this round trip took 3 years. And in many cases, the colonies from the same country back in the New World weren't even supposed to trade with each other. Back home in each capital, this seemed like the perfect solution. Happy merchants and government officials threw great parties for each other, paid for with the set prices, tariffs, customs duties, and taxes. It was going great. But across the Atlantic, as more colonies were established in different parts of the Atlantic with different specialties, the dumber this became. Boston had to buy salt from London at the set price. Then Boston was supposed to ship the salt fish it had made with the salt back to London and sell it at the set price, while London got to resell it to Spain and Italy and in the Caribbean. And then Boston had to buy sugar from London at the set price, and buy tobacco that London had purchased from Virginia, which was literally right there. Some Boston merchant was likely thinking, I could walk to Virginia faster than I can get it from London, and would literally be correct. And then there were all these set prices. This was dumb. This was extra dumb, and also slow. And many of the colonists had originally headed out to the New World because they were tired of dumb and slow. So Boston and Virginia, the Bahamas and Barbados just started trading with each other in boats built in Boston. London merchants trooped over to Parliament and yelled, "Not fair!" So the Navigation Acts were passed. If you were English, you needed to ship all your raw materials back to London and purchase all your manufactured goods from London. Doesn't matter where it came from. After some grumbling and the interference of some families that had connections in multiple colonies, it was decided some of this coastal trade was allowed. After all, it was pointed out, the slave trade didn't run through London, so if you can make an exception for that, can't you make a few others? London could. And incidentally, it was also ruled that because West Africans weren't produce of the colonies, they could be sold on to the Spanish and Dutch and the French colonies. This loophole in the Navigation Acts may be part of the reason English ships took on so much of the traffic in humans. Now, London didn't give up that much. Colonial materials and goods that didn't go through London were often slapped with tariffs and customs duties that had to be paid. And all the trade absolutely had to be done in English ships. Now, the Boston shipyards and captains pointed out, as Englishmen in an English colony, our boats are English ships. And many London merchants quibbled. English colonial ships, you mean? As you can guess, there was much wrangling. Meanwhile, back at the customs houses in the Atlantic and Caribbean colonies, these were run by a bunch of poorly paid civil servants who just wanted to get back to England where the beer was decent, wearing wool wasn't such a dumb idea for so much of the year, and you weren't always tripping over these bloody Puritans all the time. So when Boston shippers offered a bribe to maybe overlook a few things or to ignore that exchange of a bit of bacon and sugar going on over there while you were over here was always appealing. But some shippers and traders spied a bigger prize of not ever paying any tariffs, or better yet, not even having to pay the cost of goods. That's right, at last, pirates. Before there were even colonists, according to McCusker and Maynard in The Economy of British America, 1607 to 1789, quote, Englishmen were first attracted to the Caribbean to fight Spaniards, unquote. Much of the exploration and mapping done by the English on the U.S. East Coast and in the Caribbean Sea was done by men granted letters of marque from Queen Elizabeth who were there to shoot at Spaniards and take their silver. A letter of marque is permission to run around and shoot your country's enemies for fun and profit, and then you can come back home and get statues, instead of being extradited by the injured country to get hung for being a pirate. For example, Sir Walter Raleigh, the guy who headed the founding of that first Roanoke colony and a few English expeditions for El Dorado, a puffy pants wearer and author of some really sappy poetry. One of his capers was stealing some of the stuff from the Acapulco ships, the Chinese silk and porcelain and Spanish silver, as it was trooped over the Panama Isthmus in pack trains. There's no getting around it. Nearly every 16th century ship captain for all the European powers wandering around the waters of the New World was some variety of a pirate. So for the English, less than 100 years later, when London had given their privateers, patriotic adventurers, better cannons and faster boats, I have no idea why they thought these guys would suddenly straighten up and fly right. Especially since the ones least interested in following rules had likely been in that wave of early colonists, especially in the sailing trade. These boat captains all thought, I'm the one risking my neck out here on the open ocean, and London wants to start imposing rules about who I can trade with, what I can carry, and wants me to start letting government officials crawl all over my boats, see what's in it, and charging me tariffs on things? Fat chance. Now, the London merchants and the royal treasury were trying to keep things all neat and tidy, and the navy and the cartographers were trying to draw lines around our stuff to keep our gold and our sugar and our rum and our fish and on and on and on, all inside the lines. That was mercantilism. You stay inside the lines or you pay tariffs. Easy, neat and tidy. The London merchants were not at all for this free-for-all of grubby colonials negotiating their own local prices, cutting into the London profits, trading with any old random Spaniard or Frenchman or Dutchman, and messing up the English store. When we get to rum, we'll go deeper into pirates, but the important thing to understand is that on the east side of the Atlantic, Europe was trying to draw neat lines and parcel everyone into their own basket, keep score, and collect tariffs and taxes. After all, there was a lot of pride in doing your part to build up your country's pile of gold. But on the west side of the Atlantic, while gold was still the goal, it was more of a personal thing, or maybe a small group thing. Spanish, French, and Dutch sugar or tobacco growers often had more similar goals and needs than a Frenchman did with just some other random Frenchman. The kingdom you were part of often meant less than the industry and competence. When your concerns and advice were dismissed because you are colonial rather than from the capital, it could make taking seriously all the sorting and tariffs very hard sometimes. Dealing with the guys who, for a price, made deliveries, no questions asked, was much more appealing. So pirates weren't all walk the plank and buried treasure and kidnapping people. Yes, that went on, but between stealing Spanish pieces of eight and training their parrots to talk, lots of what 17th century pirates and smugglers did was fill in gaps that mercantilism created by trying to force merchants from different countries to not work together. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the colonies were really created with the hope that they would send raw material back to the home country so it could be manufactured into things that could be sold to enrich the home country. And to a certain extent, they did. And the colonies, until they were sending extra food home, were expected to purchase everything they needed from the home country, which for a while they also did. Salt had made it so European food was exportable. Food had changed from something just about everyone grew to feed themselves or their village to a good that could be sold for money. A combination of technologies expanded preserved foods and the markets to sell them in. By the 17th century, food, starting with grain and then moving on to fish, distilled liquors, cheese, butter, and meat, had again become a trade good. Which is why there were all these English people who went to America but didn't know how to grow food. By the 17th century, lots of people in the expanding European cities were buying rather than growing most of their food, or they were professional soldiers who just got food. Flour or bread came from the miller or the baker. Barrels provided dried peas. Cheese came from wheels. Meat could be bought fresh or barrel pickled from the butcher. Brined or salted fish came from a cask. In the early days, and especially in colonies that had low numbers of women, food came from barrels or was traded for. It was the women who would have been the ones to do the work of gardening for pot herbs and often root vegetables, and did the work of tending chickens for eggs and milking cows. In the colonies that had a limited population of women, less was grown, raised, and processed. Also initially, less food than you would have expected was hunted or caught. In Europe, fishing, hunting game, and shooting birds was the pastime of rich men. So most colonists often didn't know how when they arrived, especially if they already weren't farmers. And for many, sea snails, mussels, oysters, lobsters, and crabs were things that could just be picked up, so were clearly the food of the poor and desperate, so were often disdained. And thus each new wave of colonists brought all these people for whom food largely came from a barrel, a flour sack, and a cask. It would take time for these people to become adept at catching and creating food. It would take even longer for them to see the food that was right there growing on the land, right in front of them. And even then, they tended to look back. They imported seeds from home, for like riches, there was an established set of food in the world. The colonists already knew what was valuable, and there certainly couldn't be that much more to explore, could there? Next week, because everything is in bloom right now, we'll look at one type of produce the colonists were able to recognize in the New World: flowers and berries. How different regions ate and kept them, and how local products were adapted to colonial cooking and eating habits. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. If you have any questions or quibbles, and Twitter isn't your thing, you can email me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. No spaces. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.